The first snow of that cruel year arrived early, a hushed and starved thing that drifted sideways through the black pines and settled upon the unfinished timbers of the meeting house like a guilty afterthought, and those who remember still speak of how the flakes hissed when they touched the fresh-hewn beams, as though the very weather winced at what had been erected there. Dawn had not yet broken when the widowed carpenter Elias Hurlbut drew his mallet back for the final blow upon the lofts. King post, yet the concussion that followed seemed to come from inside the wood itself, a low interior groan that travelled the grain and leapt into his wrists and lodged behind his eyes like a splinter of ice. He staggered, dropped the tool, and in the sudden hush that pooled beneath the rafters he heard something else, a wet, deliberate swallowing, as if the building had taken a breath and found the taste of human air agreeable. No wind stirred. The lanterns hung motionless, their flames drawn thin and blue, and for one impossible instant Elias felt the entire structure lean inward, the way a listener leans to catch a confided sin. Then it was gone, or seemed to be, and only the ordinary ache in his knuckles remained, and the smell of pine sap cooling to amber. He told himself it was fatigue, the echo of his own pulse, the loneliness that comes of working by lamplight while others dream. Yet when he climbed down the ladder he noticed that the shavings at his feet had arranged themselves into a perfect spiral, edges inward, as though a finger had traced the shape of an ear upon the ground. He kicked them apart, cursing under his breath, but the pattern reformed at once, tighter, more attentive, and he left it there, unwilling to witness any further cleverness of the dark. By full light the settlement of Union Vale, 9 families scattered along the eastern brow of the Niagara Escarpment, was already awake, though no bell had rung and no elder had called them. They rose as if shaken by the same bad dream, doors opening in unison, bare feet finding frost-rind planks, breath steaming in small private clouds that vanished before reaching the ceiling. The wives moved without speaking to knead the morning bread, but the dough felt wrong beneath their palms, too heavy, too knowing, and when they lifted the cloth to set it by the embers they found the surface marked by impressions that might have been the ridged soles of children's shoes. Though no child had entered, the men, outdoors splitting kindling, found their axes reluctant, the blades sticking midway as though the logs had turned gristly, and when at last a wedge flew free it carried with it a smell not of sap but of iron harness buckles left to rust in blood. Even the livestock were altered. The milk goat dropped a stillborn kid whose eyes had already milked over with the grey film of old age, and the gander that ordinarily announced sunrise with shrill authority stood mute, head cocked toward the forest, listening to something approaching from the opposite direction of the wind. No one needed to say that the day was wounded. They felt it in the same way they felt the absence of a child suddenly gone quiet in the next room. The instinctual hush that precedes discovery. Yet work must continue, and so by 7 o'clock the brothers and sisters had wrapped their throats in wool and walked the half-frozen ruts toward the frame of the new meeting house, tools balanced across their shoulders like rifles. They were believers. These people, converts of the United Society come up from New Lebanon only the previous spring, hearts still blistered by the revival fires that had lately scorched the Gene country, and they carried within them the bright certainty that the world's end was negotiable if one could only sing loudly enough, build plainly enough, shake free of ornament and marriage and self. They had purchased this tract from the crown for pennies because no loyalist would live upon it, the soil being thin and the well-water tainted with a reddish stain that left the lips numb, but to the Shakers such barrenness was a sign of election, a place already emptied of competing affections. They had felled the pines, hewn the logs, raised the walls in a single feverish month, and now the roof beam was ready to be hoisted, the very last bone to be set into the skeleton of their worship. Sister Thankful Root, who at 19 had already buried 2 infants and a husband in the Presbyterian graveyard at Newark, stood upon the frozen clay with the other women, her skirts whipping about her ankles like torn flags, and felt the future settle upon her shoulders with the weight of a yoke. She had not yet spoken to anyone of the sound that had visited her before first light, a voice, or the memory of one, singing a hymn she herself had composed in a dream, the melody correct but the words chewed, unfinished, as though someone sucked the consonants out from the inside. But she knew by the pallor of the others that she was not the only recipient of such nocturnal mail. Brother Benjamin Hervey, elder by virtue of having survived 50 winters and read the entire Testament aloud without stumbling, climbed upon a stump and raised his hand for attention. His coat was the color of damp ash, his hat so wide that its brim appeared to float independent of his head, and when he spoke his voice carried the nasal twang of Connecticut, though he had not seen that state since the war. Today, he said, we set the ridge beam, and when it is seated we shall raise our voices in the first hymn this dwelling will hear. Let the timber be true, let the joints kiss close, let no nail be driven in anger. He spoke the customary words, yet as they entered the air each sentence seemed to lengthen, to grow a tail, to lash itself around his ankles, so that by the time he stepped down he was walking with the careful gait of a man who fears the ground may give advice he is not ready to receive. The brothers took up their stations along the ropes, the sisters formed a line to pass the wooden pins, and above them the beam, 40 feet of white pine floated free of the earth, swung slowly into position, creaking like a great ship breasting an inland sea of cold blue sky. For a moment all was orderly, the disciplined breathing of communal labor, the small grunts of effort kept modest, and then the beam refused. It halted 2 hands short of the mortise, hovering, as though some invisible shoulder pressed back. The men heaved again, the rope fibers popped like distant musketry. Still the wood would not enter its appointed mouth. A hush spread along the line, embarrassment first, then something less nameable, and it was then that Sister Thankful, without intending to, began to sing. The melody was the one that had woken her, but now it issued intact, each note dressed in its proper letter, and the words were those of the hymn Come Life, Shake a Life, only rearranged so that every pronoun pointed backward, toward the singer, as though the song were a hand inviting itself to arrive. Come death, shake a death, she sang, though she had never heard such a version, and her voice was thin but piercing, the kind of voice that can slide through a keyhole and reassemble on the far side. The others turned, scandalized, yet no one commanded her to stop. Instead they felt their own throats open in sympathy, not because they wished to but because the tune demanded companionship the way a frost demands fodder. One by one the sisters joined, then the brothers, until the clearing rang with a contrapuntal lament that seemed to pull the beam another inch, then another, until with a sigh neither wooden nor human it slid home. The pegs were driven, the ridge was crowned. Only when the last echo died did they realize that the snow had begun to fall again, though the sky above them was clear, and that each flake bore upon its face a perfect imprint of a human molar, roots and all, as though the heavens were shedding the discarded keys of speech. They did not speak of it at the communal dinner. Such prodigies were not unknown among them, and they had been taught that wonders are merely the weather of the unseen world, to be endured like any other storm. Yet when they gathered for the evening worship in the low room of Brother Benjamin's cabin, the benches seemed narrower, the lamp smoke thicker, the shadows under the rafters more deliberate. They sat as they always did, men on the right, women on the left, shoes aligned like boats upon a strand, and waited for the gift of song to descend. Usually it came quickly, a trembling in the knees, a nodding, then the sudden irresistible jerking that carried them into the circle dance. But tonight the silence pooled and thickened until they could feel it pressing against their eardrums with the patient weight of deep water. Sister Thankful felt her own heart knocking to be let out, and when at last the motion arrived it was not the familiar shuffle but a slow backward step, as though the floor itself were withdrawing, and every dancer followed, heels first, into a pattern none had learned. Their limbs moved with the sluggish elegance of things caught in a mill race, and the song that broke from them was not the jubilant syllabic babble of tongues but a single sustained vowel, low and darkly glimmering, that seemed to issue from a cavity larger than any throat could house. The lamps guttered, the windows filmed over from the inside. Someone's teeth began to chatter in a rhythm that matched the knocking of the ridge beam far off in the clearing, and no one knew whose mouth it was because every jaw was clamped shut against the sound. When they woke the next morning they were lying on the bare boards in perfect rows, men and women intermingled, their hands crossed upon their breasts as though the room had been prepared for viewing. Their tongues were swollen with the taste of iron, and their ears rang with a faint after hum that modulated up and down like a saw being coaxed through stubborn grain. Outside, the world had been altered overnight. The snow had melted and frozen again into a skin so clear that every blade of stubble beneath showed as a dark accusation, and upon this glassy field the meeting house stood complete, its door yawning open though no one had yet fitted the latch. They approached it in a ragged procession, shivering less from cold than from the intimacy of what they could not remember having done, and when they crossed the threshold they found the interior already inhabited by a smell not of fresh pine but of old confessionals. Candle smoke embedded in velvet, the sour sweetness of breath that has asked and been denied. The benches were arranged in concentric squares, though yesterday there had been no benches at all, and at the center stood a single wooden chair of a design none recognized, its arms carved with shallow grooves that followed the grain in patterns resembling the inner whorls of a fingerprint. Upon the seat lay a child's milk tooth, freshly uprooted, the root tip darkened as though dipped in ink, and beside it a square of parchment bearing the words, "Begin." Before you are ready. The ink was still wet, it soaked into the grain of the chair and disappeared as they watched, leaving only the faint smell of coal and winter apples. Brother Benjamin declared a day of fasting and vigil, though he himself could not fast because his stomach growled with an appetite that felt like someone else's hand reaching up inside him and impatiently drumming. They read from the testimonies of Mother Anne, they knelt, they tried to pray, but every petition circled back upon itself like a moth unable to locate the opening of a lampshade. And by afternoon they had abandoned words altogether and sat in the dimming room listening to the small arthritic sounds of a new building settling into its bones. Somewhere in the rafters a nail eased itself a quarter turn and the note it loosed rang out pure and disconsolate. A tuning fork struck against the sky, and immediately every head turned as though the sound had been a name. They understood then that the house was already singing to itself, testing its own timbre, and that they had been summoned not to fill it with praise but to provide the imperfect throats through which it might learn the accent of longing. Night slid down early, purple and windless, and with it came the first disappearance. Little Dorcas Hurlbut, Elias's daughter, last seen carrying a lantern toward the privy, was nowhere to be found. Only her tracks remained, a single line of small boot prints that led halfway across the yard and then simply ceased, the snow beyond them unbroken, as though the earth had taken a breath and drawn her up between its teeth. They searched until moonrise, calling her name into the black wells of tree trunks, but the forest returned only the echo of their own panic, thinner each time, as though something were peeling the voice away from the back of the throat and pocketing it. When they gave up and filed back through the threshold they found the chair now occupied, Dorcas's wool cloak folded neatly upon it, the hood drawn up though no head filled it, and from beneath the hem protruded a single pale foot, too small to be hers and yet bearing the scar she had got from a kettle 2 winters past. No one touched the cloak, they merely stood in a half circle, breathing the same shallow respiration, until the foot curled slowly, toes folding under as if making room for another beside it, and the cloak settled deeper into the hollow of the chair with a sound like a sigh that has travelled a long way and is too tired to be polite. It was then that Sister Thankful understood the first article of the new covenant. They were not building a house for worship, they were being tuned, fret by fret, into an instrument whose music would not be heard by the living, and the ridge beam, now solidly fixed, was the spine of something that had been waiting far longer than any of them had been alive to wait. Morning, when it returned, did so with the reluctance of a debtor stepping into daylight, the sun a thin coin hammered flat against a slate sky that seemed already to regret the expenditure. The snow had begun again during the small hours, not falling but arriving in deliberate flakes the size of communion wafers, each one imprinted with the same ghostly molar they had seen the day before, so that by dawn the clearing lay under a white quilt stitched with the abandoned keys of human speech. They woke in their plank beds feeling the afterswerve of a dream in which they had all been walking backward in the same tracks, men and women indistinguishable, the forest closing behind them like a book whose final page had been glued to the cover. No one spoke of the cloak or the foot, such reticence was habitual among people taught to distrust the theatricality of individual testimony. Yet each carried the image lodged behind the eyes the way a splinter carries the memory of the knife. Breakfast was taken standing, bread and buttermilk consumed in mechanical bites while they listened to the new meeting house creak out its first full day of existence, the timbers adjusting to the weight of silence they had installed within it. Brother Benjamin, his beard seeming to have greyed another shade overnight, announced that work must resume, for idleness was the trough in which fear grew fat. and they would raise the interior benches and fashion the sliding shutters that would keep the worship contained, season by season, until the earth itself should roll away like a stone. No one pointed out that the house already possessed benches, or that the shutters they had never built were already fitted and closed, because to do so would be to acknowledge a tenant who had moved in without signing the covenant, and such acknowledgment was the first thin ice upon which heresy skate. So they labored, or pretended to, carrying planks that felt heavier than their substance could account for, as though the boards had been soaked overnight in some invisible mineral that added mass each time the air touched them. Elias Hulbert, whose daughter's absence clung to him like a second shirt, found that every beam he lifted bore upon its underside a series of small concave depressions arranged in pairs, 5 to a row, the exact width of a child's fingertips pressed into green wood. That had since hardened around the memory. He said nothing, only planed the marks away, but the shavings curled off the color of old ivory, and when they landed they did not settle. They drifted sideways across the floor as if drawn by a current of air that originated inside the grain itself. By midday the room had grown dim though the sun stood at its zenith, and they realized the windows had clouded over from the inside with a film that resembled breath frozen upon glass, only thicker, more deliberate, swirling into patterns that suggested the whirls of an inner ear. Sister Thankful, assigned to scrape the panes, found that when she pressed her cloth against the fog it yielded slightly, then pushed back, a slow pulse traveling outward as though the house were listening through the very pores of its skin. She withdrew her hand and the print remained, not of her palm but of her lifeline, forked and dark. And when she looked again the line had lengthened and bifurcated once more. A map of some country she had not yet visited but whose customs she already feared. At the noon pause they filed outside to take air, and the cold struck them with the intimacy of a confessor's breath upon the cheek. The clearing was unchanged except for the appearance of a single set of tracks leading from the doorway to the center of the frozen yard, where they terminated in a perfect circle of bare earth the size of a wagon wheel, the soil within it dark and warm enough to steam. No footprint approached or departed. The circle was simply there, as though a plug had been lifted and replaced. They stood around it in a hush broken only by the small wet click of cooling sap in the nearby stumps, and one by one they became aware of a sound emanating from beneath the ground, a low monotonous hum that matched the pitch they had sung the night before. Only slower, as though the earth itself were learning the melody by heart. Brother Benjamin knelt, pressed his ear to the soil, and rose with a fleck of blood upon the lobe. He said only that the ground was warmer than it ought to be, and that they must return to work before the daylight failed, though the sun had scarcely begun its decline. As they turned away the circle closed, the soil drawing together like a mouth pursing after a secret swallowed too hot, and the steam rose a final time, in the shape of a small hand before dispersing upon the wind that did not blow. Inside again, they found the house altered. The chair at the center had multiplied, for now stood in a square, each facing outward, each bearing upon its seat a single object, a child's shoe, a tin spoon bent double, a hank of blonde hair tied with red thread, and a square of linen embroidered with the initial D in a hand too precise to be any but Dorcas Hurlbert's own. The linen was still warm. Elias took a step toward it and halted, for the floorboards beneath his weight gave out a note, clear and ringing, the very tone they had sustained the previous night in their unknowing choir, and the chair legs trembled in sympathetic resonance. Sister Thankful felt the sound enter through the soles of her shoes and travel upward until it lodged behind her tongue, where it pulsed like a second heart, and she understood that the building was no longer content to receive their songs. It had begun to sing back, tuning them the way one tunes a viol by twisting the peg until the wood protests. They removed the objects in silence, placed them in a box intended for nails, and tried to resume their labor, but every hammer blow now produced not the crisp report of iron entering pine but a softer, wetter sound, as though the nails were being driven into something already alive and reluctant. Dusk arrived early, coagulating in the corners before the sun had properly set, and with it came the first frost that was not white but reddish, a faint blush upon every surface that tasted of the mineral taint they had been warned against in the well water. They gathered for worship because custom demanded it, though the idea of song now felt presumptuous, like speaking in church during the consecration. Brother Benjamin read from the rolls, "Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. But the word sounded ironical in a place where children disappeared and the ground itself grew fertile only with voices. They took their places, men on the right, women on the left, and waited for the trembling to begin. It did not come. Instead, the silence deepened until it acquired texture, a velvet heaviness that pressed upon their shoulders and forced their heads downward until their chins rested against their collarbones in an attitude of permanent nodding. When at last the sound arrived, it was not from their own throats but from the rafters, a slow creaking alphabet of wood under strain, forming itself into syllables that they recognized as their own names spoken backward, the final letter of each grazing the ear like the tip of a knife drawn across a whetstone. They sat transfixed while the house recited them, one by one, until every soul present had been accounted for except Dorcas, whose absence was pronounced as a pause too long, a hole in the liturgy through which the cold poured in. Then the chairs began to move, not sliding, not scraping, but growing, extending their legs inch by inch into the floorboards as though the planks were soft wax, and as they descended the room's geometry altered, the walls bowing outward to accommodate the new depth, the ceiling rising to keep proportion, so that they sat within a cube expanding in silence, a lung filling with air that had never known warmth. The entrance door, which had stood ajar, now swung gently shut without touching the frame, and the latch fell into place with the polite click of a doctor setting down his bag after delivering unwelcome news. They felt the expansion stop, the house having reached the dimensions required, and in the hush that followed they heard the first unmistakably human sound of the evening, a child's cough. Small and polite, originating from somewhere beneath the floor, Elias Hurlbut rose without permission, crossed to the spot, and knelt, pressing his ear to the boards the way a father listens for returning feet upon a winter road. The cough came again, closer, followed by a whisper that traveled the grain and emerged directly into his ear. "I am not cold, but I am very crowded." He tore at the planks with his bare hands, nails splitting backward. But the wood refused to yield, offering only the small complacent smile of something already digested. Brother Benjamin commanded him to cease, for what is sealed by a wisdom larger than grief, and Elias was led away, palms bleeding, eyes fixed upon the spot as though he could see through darkness and timber to whatever cellar had been prepared below. The worship resumed, though it was no longer worship but vigil, and they remained seated while the night outside grew old, the reddish frost deepening to the color of venous blood, the windows weeping slow drops that froze mid-fall into small pendant teeth. Toward midnight the chairs began to shrink again, withdrawing their legs with a sigh that sounded almost regretful, and the room contracted to its former proportions, leaving behind for dark holes in the floor, perfectly square, filled with a blackness that seemed to go down farther than the foundation could allow. Into these holes they dropped, one by one, the objects they had found, the shoe, the spoon, the hair, the monogrammed cloth, and when the last item vanished, they heard from far below a sound like the closing of a tiny lid, the click of a box that will not need to be opened again. Then the trembling finally came, but it was not the joyful shaking of souls unburdened, it was the tremor of a body that realizes it has been inhabited by something older than language, and they shook not in circles but in a slow backward undulation, as though the floor itself were rocking over a depth they had only begun to sound. When they emerged at dawn the clearing was empty of footprints save their own leading in, and the snow had resumed its ordinary whiteness, but every face bore upon it the flushed imprint of something leaned too close in the dark, a kiss of pressure and heat that would not fade with washing, and they understood that the house had taken its first full breath, and that the next would be deeper. The third dawn broke without color, a slow brightening that felt more like the withdrawal of a dimmer cloth than the honest return of the sun, and when the believers stepped outside they found the clearing transfigured into a single pane of ice so flawless it reflected not their faces but their silhouettes from the day previous, each figure walking backward, coats buttoned wrong, mouths opened in shapes that belonged to tomorrow's grief. No one had yet spoken of leaving, though the thought circled every mind the way a hawk circles a field it has already decided to stoop upon. Silent, inevitable, patient, they dressed in the same garments they had worn the day before, because the wash lines had frozen solid during the night and the shirts hung stiff as exorcised ghosts, arms outstretched in the attitude of those who have forgotten the words to their own funeral hymn. Breakfast was a formality. The milk tasted of the reddish mineral again. Stronger now, as though the well had begun to bleed its own geology, and when they swallowed they felt the iron travel down like a thermometer bulb seeking the exact depth at which the soul could be said to reside. Brother Benjamin read a brief chapter from the testimonies, but the page he opened to was one none had seen before, the paper darker at the edges, the ink raised as if still wet, and the words described a vision in which Mother Anne appeared to a congregation of hollow trees and taught them to clap their branches in time with a heartbeat that came from underground. He closed the book at once, yet the sentence continued inside their heads, marching in a circle, and they understood that Scripture itself had begun to annex new territory. Work was impossible. The ice refused any purchase of ladder or nail, and the hammers rang out with a brittle, apologetic sound, as though the iron heads were ashamed to be discovered in the act. Instead they were set to splitting firewood, a labor that required no assent, and they formed a line upon the frozen ground, men swinging axes, women gathering the pieces, the children, those who remained, stacking the cordwood into walls that looked from a distance like small unroofed cells. With every blow the ice responded with a note deeper than the ear could comfortably admit, a subterranean chime that traveled the nerves more than the air, and after an hour of it their teeth ached in their sockets as if the roots had been replaced with fine cold wire. Elias Hurlbut worked without pause, splitting knotty birch that should have been left to season, the impact jarring up through his wrists and lodging behind his eyes in bright starbursts that repeated, again and again, the image of Dorcas's footprint ending mid-stride. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the 4 dark holes in the meeting house floor, and from each hole a thread of reddish frost climbing the air like ivy reversing its growth, weaving itself into the shape of a small girl standing upright but hollow, her mouth a perfect O through which the wind blew uninterrupted. When the axe head finally flew off its helve and vanished into the trees he did not search for it. He merely stood, breathing steam, palms bleeding afresh where the blisters had broken and refrozen, and listened to the echo of the last blow fading inside the trunks as though the forest itself were a drum. Sister Thankful had been assigned to the kitchen cabin, tasked with boiling water for the soaking of beans, but the kettle refused to reach a proper roll. Instead the surface trembled at the precise frequency of the hymn they had sung 2 nights previous, the water bowing into small glassy ridges that caught the firelight and threw it back in Morse-like dashes upon the walls. She found herself watching the reflections the way one watches rain sliding down a windowpane in childhood, half hypnotized, and after a time she became aware that the dashes were spelling something, over and over, a short sentence in the private shorthand she had invented as a girl to diary the sins she dared not confess. The sentence was, "The chair remembers your weight." She stepped back, upsetting the kettle, and the water that spilled hissed against the frosted floorboards and etched there, in a handwriting too fine to belong to any human finger, the opening bars of the backward hymn. The marks were not brown with scorch but red, the color of the stain in the well, and when she knelt to scrub them away the cloth came up dry and perfectly white, yet the boards remained etched, the grain raised as though the song had been grown rather than written. She went outside, heart hammering a tempo that did not belong to her body, and saw that the men had ceased their chopping and were standing in a loose semicircle around something that had not been there at dawn, a stump, freshly cut, the center scooped out into a bowl that held a quantity of water perfectly still despite the wind that had begun to move the treetops. The surface of the water reflected not the sky but the interior of the meeting house, the 4 chairs facing outward, and upon each chair a small figure seated upright, heads bowed as if in examination of their own laps. She could not see their faces, but she knew them nevertheless, the lost children of Union Vale, those who had sickened on the passage from New Lebanon, those who had wandered into the forest after berries and returned changed, those who had never returned at all. The reflection was so clear that she could see the grain of the wood beneath their shoes, and when one of the small figures lifted its head she saw that its eyes were closed but its mouth was opening and closing in the slow deliberate cadence of a child reciting a lesson. "It does not yet understand," she cried out. The men turned, the reflection vanished, leaving only a stump of fresh-cut pine weeping sap the color of pale honey. Yet the image lingered behind her eyes, and when Brother Benjamin approached to ask what had distressed her, she found she could not form the words, for her tongue had gone thick and unwieldy as if it had been packed in wet clay. He studied her face with the resigned tenderness of a physician who has seen the same symptom bloom upon a dozen prior cheeks, then led her back toward the cabins, signaling the others to resume their labor, but the axes would not lift, their heads adhered to the frozen ground as though magnetized, and when the men finally freed them they discovered that the cutting edges had been notched in tiny regular serrations, 5 to an inch, the exact imprint of a child's incisors. They looked at one another, then at the forest, whose dark interior now seemed to be listening with the patience of a confessor who already knows the sin, but wishes to hear the sinner articulated. One by one they laid the axes down and walked back toward the clearing, leaving the cordwood half-stacked, the split pieces already glazing over with the same reddish bloom that had touched every surface overnight. Evening worship was compulsory, but when they entered the meeting house they found that the benches had been rearranged into a spiral that began at the door and wound inward toward the 4 chairs, which now stood upon a low platform that had not existed at noon. The chairs were occupied. In each sat a garment only, Dorcas's cloak, little Silas Root's knitted cap, the pinafore of the infant who had died on the trail and been buried beneath a cairn so shallow that wolves had worried the stones. Within the week, and a 4th item none could at first identify, a length of white linen, finely hemmed, embroidered at one corner with the letter T. Sister Thankful recognized it as the cuff of the night-dress she had worn the night she dreamed the backward hymn, the fabric she had torn up for bandages 2 days later, yet here it was whole, unstained, the buttonhole still fastened as though the wrist within it had simply evaporated. They stood uncertainly in the doorway, unwilling to step upon the spiral, for the boards within it had darkened to the color of interior flesh and gleamed faintly, as if recently planed and rubbed with tallow. Brother Benjamin led them in a psalm, but the words emerged thin and reedy, defeated by the acoustics of the spiral that seemed to swallow consonants and return only vowels, elongated, mournful, rising and falling like the breathing of someone asleep in the same room but just beyond the reach of lamplight. When the song ended the garments did not move, yet every watcher felt them settle more deeply into the chairs, as though invisible bodies had relaxed into the embrace of an audience finally arrived. The lamps were lit, but their flames burned low and horizontal, pointing inward toward the center, and the smoke that rose from them did not dissipate but collected beneath the rafters in a low blue cloud that slowly descended the curve of the spiral until it hovered at the height of a man's breastbone. Within the cloud they began to see small bright points of light, like stars reflected in moving water, and as the cloud settled further they realized that each point was a tooth, milk-white, roots intact, drifting in slow orbit as though suspended in some denser medium than air. The teeth began to rotate, very slowly, and as they turned they struck against one another with a faint chime, forming chords that matched the hymn they had sung on the night of the raising, only transposed into a minor key that made the melody feel homesick for a country it had never visited. One by one the believers felt their own jaws ache in sympathetic vibration, and when Sister Thankful involuntarily opened her mouth a single note emerged, perfect, sustained, unsupported by breath, as though something inside her had taken custody of the chord and would not release it until the song had reached its terminus. The note traveled the spiral, echoing off the curved pews, and where it passed the boards darkened further, the grain opening into thin fissures that exhaled a smell of iron and apples left too long in a closed trunk. When the sound finally died the teeth had arranged themselves into a perfect circle suspended above the chairs, and within that circle the air grew opaque, milky, until it resembled an eye that had rolled upward to regard its own interior. They were still staring into it when the lamps guttered out all at once, leaving only the phosphorescence of the teeth, and in that dim glow they saw the garments begin to collapse inward, fabric folding upon itself with the slow deliberation of petals closing at dusk, until each chair held only a small, dense bundle the size of an infant newly swaddled. Then the circle of teeth descended, settling upon the bundles like a crown pressed onto the brow of a sleeper who will never again require awakening, and the light went out, not gradually but all at once, as though someone had drawn a shutter across the inside of the eye. They sat in darkness, breathing in unison, while outside the wind that had not blown all day began to move the trees, a long slow exhalation that carried with it the smell of snow about to arrive, and somewhere within that wind they heard the small clear voice of Dorcas Hurlbut reciting the alphabet backward, each letter landing softly, irrevocably, like the first flakes of the storm that would bury the clearing before morning, and that would fall, they now understood, not from the sky but from the rafters, flake by flake, tooth by tooth, until the house had grown its own white quilt beneath which every name would be spelled correctly, once and for all. The storm that had been promised by the wind arrived not as weather but as architecture, each flake slotting into the last with the patience of a mason laying courses of invisible stone. By morning the meeting house had been walled entirely within a sheath of snow that admitted no chink of outer light, so that when the believers pushed against the door they found it immovable, sealed from without by a pressure that felt less like weight than like decision. They emerged instead through a rear window, crawling one by one across the drifted threshold, and stood blinking in a dawn the color of dishwater, the clearing transformed into a crater whose rim was the forest and whose center was the dark rectangle of the house, now a mausoleum freshly delivered. The snow continued to fall but only upon the structure itself, a private weather that ignored the surrounding ground. They watched the eaves disappear, the ridge beam submerge, until the building resembled nothing so much as a body, being prepared for burial by hands that preferred their work to remain unwitnessed. No one spoke of the bundles left upon the chairs. To retrieve them would require re-entry through the window, and none wished to crawl back into the throat that had so recently learned their names. Instead they set about the business of survival, breaking ice from the well curb, coaxing fire from the reluctant hearth, but even the flames burned sullen, their light tinged with the same rusty hue that discolored the water, so that every face appeared to be recovering from a long illness whose principal symptom was the memory of blood. It was Sister Thankful who first noticed the absence of echo. When she dropped a kettle lid the metal struck the floor with a thud that ended at once, as though the sound had been pocketed by an auditor standing too near. When she spoke her voice returned to her mouth already finished, a parcel unwrapped and empty. She stepped outside and tested the air, same result. Her breath fell dead 2 paces from her lips, and the small mechanical sounds of the settlement, the chop of wood, the creak of a hinge, arrived already muffled, predigested, as though the clearing had been wrapped in batting thick enough to stifle any cry before it could reach the forest that surely stood only a few rods distant yet now appeared to retreat by a measurable degree each time she blinked. She walked toward the tree line and found that after 20 paces she was no closer. The trunks receded at the exact rate of her advance, maintaining the same interval of shadow and light, and when she turned the meeting house had drawn nearer, though she had walked directly away. The snow upon its roof had begun to glow faintly from within, a rose-colored luminescence pulsing at the tempo of a resting heart, and she understood that the house had become the center of a compass whose cardinal points were not north, south, east, west, but toward, away, closer, inside. She returned to tell the others, but they had already discovered it. The men who had set out to hunt found themselves circling back upon their own boot prints. The boys sent to fetch straw from the barn arrived carrying the identical bundles they had departed with, the sheaves undisturbed, the knots tied in the same weary boughs. Space had grown polite, deferential, refusing to permit any departure that might wound the feelings of the building that now commanded it. By afternoon the cold had become theatrical, a cruelty that wished to be admired for its precision. The well water froze from the bottom upward, a phenomenon the oldest among them had heard attributed to Siberian steppes but never to Canada. They broke the crust and found beneath it a column of ice so clear they could see the coin-like reflection of their own faces suspended at the center, each visage wearing an expression of mild surprise, as though caught in the act of forgetting something important. When they hauled the column out it came in one piece, a cylinder the height of a man, and within it no bubble or floor except for a single dark thread that ran from top to bottom, wavering slightly, the exact diameter of a child's finger. They stood it against the cabin wall and agreed to thaw it by the fire. But the ice refused to yield, remaining hard as glass while the hearthstones themselves began to sweat and crack with the heat. Around midnight the column began to emit a sound, faint at first, the click of distant knitting needles. then resolving into the unmistakable cadence of a hymn tapped out upon the rungs of a ladder, the same ladder Elias had climbed the day the ridge beam was set. They covered it with blankets, but the tapping only deepened, becoming a code that spelled, in the private rhythmic alphabet the believers used to record gifts of the Spirit, the sentence, "The rungs remember the feet." At dawn the column was gone, leaving only a damp outline upon the floorboards and a single drop of water hanging from the ceiling beam, trembling, refusing to fall, as though time itself had been persuaded to hesitate. Elias Hervey, eldest after brother Benjamin, proposed that they abandon the settlement and trek the dozen miles to the nearest loyalist hamlet, but when he opened the store chest to count the provisions he found every sack already emptied and refilled with snow that bore the imprint of small teeth, as though someone had bitten and released, tasting each handful and finding it insufficiently seasoned. The flour was gone, the salt, the dried apples, even the seed corn. Intended for spring, only the brown bread remained, hard as pewter, and when they sawed it open they discovered at its center a perfect ear of human teeth, roots aligned, the enamel yellowed but intact, baked now into the crumb so thoroughly that to remove it would be to destroy the loaf entire. They ate it nevertheless, for hunger is less negotiable than disgust, and each mouthful tasted of iron and communion. The two flavors braided so tightly that to swallow was to confess and be absolved. In the same motion, while they ate, the snow upon the meeting-house roof began to slide downward in a single sheet, peeling away like skin from a wound that has decided to reveal its architecture. What was exposed was not pine shingle but a surface of polished grey stone, seamless, reflecting the sky with the indifferent sheen of water beneath a bridge, and within that reflection they saw themselves standing in a circle, though in reality they remained scattered across the clearing, some indoors, some out, each alone. The reflected circle completed itself, joined hands, and began to revolve slowly, clockwise, while the actual people felt their own sleeves tugged by nothing, their palms warmed by contact with an intimacy that had already happened but had not yet arrived. Night brought no darkness, only a lowering of the grey to the shade of wool soaked in ash water, and with it came the second disappearance. Sister Silence Peace, a woman of 40 years who had not spoken since the day she watched her first husband burn in the barn fire at New Canaan, was discovered missing from her bed. They searched the cabins, the woods, the icebound creek, but found only her shoes placed side by side before the door of the meeting house, the laces tied in a neat bow, the toes pointing inward as though she had stepped out of them directly into the structure itself. The snow upon the threshold was unbroken, but the door now stood ajar, though they had left it sealed with frost the night before. Brother Benjamin led the way inside, lantern held high, and they saw that the spiral of benches had been restored, only now it wound downward, the pews sunken into the floor as though the earth beneath had been excavated to create a funnel whose terminus was the 4 chairs, still occupied by the 4 small bundles. The chairs had turned to face the center, and upon the seat of the foremost sat Sister Silence's apron, folded square, atop it her prayer cap, the pleats as precise as the day she received it. From the aperture at the center of the spiral rose a faint luminescence the color of candle fat, and within it a sound that might have been breathing or might have been the sea heard through a length of pipe. They descended the spiral because there was nothing else to do, each step taking them deeper than the physical dimensions of the house could permit. The boards beneath their feet giving off a soft give, as though they walked upon the stretched hide of something recently killed and not yet cooled. When they reached the bottom they found the floor had become a mirror of polished obsidian in which their reflection stood delayed by half a heartbeat, so that when they raised a hand the image followed a moment later, the lag increasing as they watched, until the reflected figures stood entire seconds behind, mouthing words that had not yet been spoken, weeping tears that had not yet been summoned. At the center of the mirror lay a small iron ring, flush with the surface, and when Elias Hurlbut knelt and lifted it the mirror split along a seam and folded back like an eyelid, revealing a staircase descending into a warmth that smelled of straw and apples and wet wool, the intimate odor of childhood winters that had been happy but could no longer be remembered as such. They descended because the spiral had delivered them here, and because Sister Silence's shoes stood empty above, and because the house had begun to breathe through the opening with a rhythm that matched their own accelerated hearts. The stairs were narrow, the rises uneven, some too shallow, some so deep they required the traveler to climb backwards, and the walls on either side were lined with the identical teeth they had eaten from the bread, set into the earth at regular intervals, roots outward, so that the passage glowed faintly with the ivory of what had once been smiles. At the bottom they found a room whose dimensions they could not ascertain, for the darkness possessed texture, a velvet thickness that absorbed the lantern glow before it could travel farther than the length of an outstretched arm, and within that darkness they heard the unmistakable sound of a woman humming, the tune neither hymn nor lullaby but something older, the melody of a cradle song that had been sung before language had learned to behave. They called Sister Silence by name, and the humming paused, replaced by a sigh that seemed to express not relief but resignation, the sound of someone who has been waiting and now discovers that what arrives is only more waiting. The lantern flickered, steadied, and in the small circle of light they saw her feet first, bare, the soles calloused but clean, the ankles crossed as though she sat in contemplation, and when they raised the flame they found her seated upon a low wooden stool, her skirt spread neatly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes open but filmed with the same milk-white cloud they had seen upon the eyes of the stillborn kid. She was not alone. Around her in a circle sat the 4 bundles, now unwrapped, each revealing a quantity of teeth arranged into the approximate shape of a child, 5 teeth to each tiny jaw, the enamel gleaming with the wetness of recent extraction. Sister Silence looked up, or rather her head tilted in their direction, and when she opened her mouth they expected words, but what emerged was a note, the same note they had sung in the meeting house, only now stripped of harmony, naked, sustained, and as it left her lips the teeth upon the floor began to vibrate, clicking together in soft applause, arranging and rearranging themselves into new configurations, first a spiral, then a circle, then the outline of a door. They fled because the note was entering their own mouths, sliding down the tongue like a communion wafer dipped in blood, and they understood that the house had not taken Sister Silence, it had installed her as a tuning fork, a keeper of the pitch, and that the next time they sang it would not be they who provided the melody but she who drew it from them the way a bow draws sound from a string that has already surrendered. They climbed the staircase, the mirror folding shut behind them, and when they emerged into the lantern light of the meeting house the door was once again sealed with frost. But the 4 bundles were gone, and in their place upon each chair sat a single tooth, roots outward, planted upright into the wood as though the seats themselves were gums learning to smile. They carried Sister Silence's shoes back to the cabin and set them before the hearth. But the fire would not warm them, and throughout the night the leather twitched intermittently, as though a foot still inside were trying to remember the way home. The cold deepened by degrees so small they could be measured only in the mind's fatigue, or exhaustion that began between the ticking of the clock and the beating of the heart, until time itself felt like a wire drawn so fine it no longer conducted warmth. They woke each morning to find the windows quilted on the inside with a frost that reproduced the pattern of their dreams, spirals, teeth, the repeated oval of an open mouth, so faithfully that to scrape it away would have been to erase the only map of where they had traveled in sleep. The days contracted to the width of a single thought: stay alive, stay silent, stay together. Yet togetherness itself had become porous. They moved through the clearing like figures painted on a scroll that was being rolled tighter, the spaces between them narrowing until they could feel one another's pulses traveling through the boards beneath their boots. Brother Benjamin instituted hourly prayer. Brief corporate sighs offered standing in the snow. But the words froze as they left the mouth and fell tinkling to the ground, where they lay like shards of a language that had forgotten how to mean. They gathered them nevertheless, collecting the icy slivers in a wooden trencher, hoping that when spring arrived they might be thawed and rearranged into some confession sufficient to purchase release. Until then they kept the trencher beneath the hearthstone, and at night they heard the fragments shifting, settling, trying to reassemble themselves into the original sentences, the way bones in an opened grave are said to yearn toward their proper order. Elias Hurlbut had begun to carve. He claimed it was only to keep his hands from remembering the weight of the axe, but the work possessed him with the single-mindedness of a man copying a document he no longer comprehends. He chose pine from the same lot that had supplied the ridge beam, and with a chisel ground thin as a razor he incised, line by line, the entire hymn they had sung that first night. only reversed so that the notes marched from right to left, the word spelled backward, the cadence inhaling rather than exhaling. When the plank was full he began another, and another, until the walls of his cabin were lined with texts that could be read only by mirror or by tongue, and at night he lay listening to the boards creak as the reverse syllables tightened within the grain, a slow contraction like the drawing of a scar. One evening he found that the shavings at his feet had arranged themselves into the outline of a small boot, complete with eyelets and laces, and when he lifted it the entire form came up in one piece, a fragile netting of wood so light it might have been the husk of a song that had shed its melody. He set it upon the window sill, and by morning it had absorbed enough moisture from the air to soften into something resembling leather. The surface darkened, the scent of pine resin replaced by the intimate smell of a child's foot after a day of sledding. He could not bring himself to destroy it. Instead he placed it beside Dorcas's real shoe, and the pair stood together like sisters who have forgotten which of them is alive, until the toes of the carved boot began to curl inward, slowly, almost politely, as though it had just remembered an appointment elsewhere. The well had begun to speak, not in words, but in the cadence of water rising and falling against the stone throat, a slow deliberate respiration that matched the communal heartbeat they had noticed whenever they stood in circle. At dawn the level was low enough to reveal the reddish stain banding the walls like a tide mark. By dusk it had risen to within a handbreadth of the curb, and the stain had climbed correspondingly, darker now, almost black, the color of iron that has surrendered to rust and begun to relish the transformation. They drew water only when necessity overcame dread, and each bucket arrived tasting of winter apples left to ferment in a coffin. Sister, thankful, sent to haul the day's supply, found the surface trembling in concentric rings, and within each ring a reflection that was not her own but of someone standing behind her, a figure whose face she could not see but whose apron bore the embroidered initial S. The thread the same color as the stain upon the stone. She turned, and the clearing was empty, yet when she looked again the figure remained, closer now, the rings traveling outward as though a stone had been dropped by an invisible hand. She dropped the bucket, and the splash sent up a single droplet that landed upon her lip, tasting of salt and confession. From that moment her tongue began to cleave to the roof of her mouth at unexpected intervals, and when she succeeded in freeing it, she found the imprint of a small tooth indented upon the surface, as though she had been carrying a child's bite within her mouth all along and only now discovered the scar. Brother Benjamin, sensing the loosening of the world's weave, decreed that no one should sleep alone. They dragged the straw pallets into the largest cabin, arranging them in a wheel whose hub was the hearth, and they took turns keeping watch, 2 by 2, staring into the embers while the others lay rigid beneath blankets that had begun to feel heavier each night, as though the wool were absorbing the sediment of dreams. The watchers spoke little, for conversation required a future in which words might arrive at their intended destination. Yet on the third night Elias Hurlbut and Thankful Root sat together and felt the silence grow a tongue. It spoke first in the small crack of a log settling, then in the shift of a coal that released a spark traveling upward in a curve that spelled, against the dark chimney brick, the letter D. They followed the spark with their eyes until it vanished, and when they looked back the fire had arranged itself into the outline of a chair, 4 legs, high back, the seat glowing red. The image held for the space of a breath, then collapsed, but the heat that had shaped it remained, a local warmth that touched only their faces, as though someone had leaned close to whisper. Elias felt the skin of his cheek pucker, the old scar left by a splinter the day the ridge beam was raised, and when he lifted his hand to touch it the scar was gone, the flesh smooth, but the pain had migrated inward and lodged behind his eye, where it throbbed. With the precise tempo of the hymn he had been carving in reverse, he turned to Thankful and saw that her lip was bleeding, a single drop swelling and falling into the fire with a hiss that produced a smell of baptismal water sprinkled upon hot iron, and they understood that the house was collecting its tithe in increments too small to refuse, a grain of pain here, a syllable of blood there, until the full account should be balanced. The next morning the trencher beneath the hearthstone was found cracked in two, the halves slightly parted, and between them a single sprout of green so pale it appeared colorless, the first growing thing they had seen since autumn. They lifted the halves carefully and saw that the sprout had emerged from the piled ice slivers of their frozen prayers, and that its root was not vegetable but mineral, a hair-fine wire of reddish rust that descended into the earth beneath the cabin, trembling faintly, as though a current traveled it. Brother Benjamin declared it a sign of life persisting, evidence that the covenant yet held, and he forbade anyone to uproot it. Instead they watered it with the reddish liquid from the well, a few drops each day, and watched it lengthen, leafless, until it resembled a blade of grass cast in iron, bending under its own weight yet remaining unbroken. On the 7th day it produced a single node, a swelling the size of a millet grain, and from this node there issued, at intervals measurable only by the heart, a sound too high for the ear but sufficient to set the teeth on edge, the same note that Sister Silence had issued underground, only now inverted, rising, a question being asked repeatedly. They took to sleeping with wool packed between their jaws to still the vibration, yet the note travelled the bones directly, and each morning they woke to find their mouths tasted of the iron they had been drinking, their tongues the colour of old pennies. Winter deepened, and with it the conviction that the season had become a garment they were required to wear until it fused with the skin. The meeting house, entombed in its private snow, had not been entered since the night of the teeth, yet they saw it none the less whenever they closed their eyes, the image arriving fully detailed, as though the building had migrated inward and set up residence behind the optic nerve. They began to dream in chorus, the same dream visiting each sleeper, a room whose walls aligned with the reversed carvings of Elias. The hymn spelled backward so insistently that it forgets its original direction, and becomes a snake devouring its tail. Within the room a chair that grows from the floor like a tree, its arms bifurcating into branches that bear not leaves but teeth, each tooth translucent, containing a small moving figure, a child swimming in ivory. Upon waking they carried the dream with them into daylight, a haze that blurred the edges of every task, so that when they lifted a bucket they were uncertain whether it contained water or the sound of water, whether they were drinking or only paraphrasing thirst. One morning they found that the carved boot upon the windowsill had developed a lace, a thread of reddish fibre that travelled across the sill, down the wall, and disappeared beneath the door, where it re-emerged in the snow. A single line stitching toward the meeting house. Elias followed it, though the cold burned the soles of his feet through his moccasins, and when he arrived at the buried structure he saw that the thread entered the snow wall at the precise height of a child's heart, the hole it made so small it might have been mistaken for the entrance of a beetle. He knelt, pressed his eye to the aperture, and saw within a darkness so complete it felt like being looked at through the wrong end of a telescope, and from far away, travelling along the tunnel of that gaze, came the sound of a boot heel clicking against wood, once, twice, then the small decisive thud of a latch falling home. He rose and walked back. But the footprints he left were single. The left foot only, as though the right had been borrowed and not yet returned. The sprout beneath the hearth had begun to flower. The blossom was no larger than a mustard seed, colourless, but it possessed a scent that could not be smelled directly. Only when they turned away did it arrive, a memory of apple blossom and formaldehyde braided so tightly that to inhale was to taste both birth and preservation at once. The scent lingered in the clothing, the hair, the folds of the Bible's pages, so that worship became an exercise in breathing shallowly, afraid to draw too much of the future into the lungs. One evening Sister Thankful woke to find the blossom had shed a single petal, and the petal had landed upon her lip, where it adhered, cold and wet, until she tasted iron and realized it had become a drop of her own blood traveling back into her mouth. She rose and went to the window, and saw that the reddish thread had multiplied, strands now connecting every cabin to the meeting house, a web pulsing faintly, and at each intersection there hovered a tooth, suspended, turning slowly, catching the moonlight that was not moonlight but the same rose-colored glow that had begun to seep through the seams of the buried roof. She counted them, 40 in all, one for every inhabitant save the missing, and as she watched each tooth oriented itself toward the window behind which she stood, as though acknowledging an audience it had not yet decided to address, she felt the note begin again inside her jaw, rising, insistent, and she understood that the house was completing its education, learning to pronounce them not as a chorus but as separate syllables of a single word it would soon be ready to speak aloud. Behind her the others slept on, breathing in unison, a slow deliberate cadence that matched the pulsing of the web, and she knew that when the word was finally formed it would be spoken not by any living throat but by the interval between one heartbeat and the next, and that once heard it would require no translation, for its meaning would arrive already settled into the bone, like winter settling into the grain of pine, season after season, until the wood forgets it was ever capable of singing any other direction.